Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Rob and I recorded on Tuesday, not our normal recording time. I think everything still holds, but if things feel even a little out of date, that is why. This was a great episode. We were both on our, we're always trying to be on our A game for you, but I think we were both on our A game this time, and the world is giving us plenty to discuss. You can email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you have any questions about anything you heard, any books you want to recommend, you want to talk about the things we talked about in the podcast, you want to talk to me about anything else. That's the email address. I read everything and try to reply to everything that comes through. Otherwise, it's crazy out there. Take care of the people that you love. Cheers and see you out there. All right, Rob, we're doing something very dangerous. We're recording on a Tuesday, which is not our normal recording slot, and we have ambitions of keeping our cadence of posting this on Friday. With the way that things are developing in the world, that's a dangerous choice that we're making here, and we'll push it out if we need to beforehand. But if you're listening to this on Friday, it was recorded on Tuesday, so God knows what could change in the world before then. Rob, I saw the videos of that crazy hailstorm in Paris, and you haven't mentioned it. Were you around for that?
Oh, it was totally wild. There were huge chunks of ice and, building on our windowsill. I was there with the kids watching it, and my son asked if we could open the window. I said no.
Probably a good decision. Yeah, well, massive hailstorms in Paris, feet of snow in New Orleans this winter. Who says that nothing interesting?
Dogs and cats living together.
Yeah. All right. We've got a busy set today, and I was supposed to be up early for an interview that canceled on me at the last second. So I've had lots of time to prepare and many cups of coffee. So I'm always on my A game with you, Rob, but I am particularly ready and rearing to go here. If the listeners are afraid that I'm talking too fast, that's why. I'm really amped. We got a couple different topics to dive into. The first is the story about the Taiwanese dollar. So I don't know if all of our listeners will be following this particularly closely, but it's blown the FinTwit community up on social media. And even some of the folks like Louis Gov and some of the others are talking about this like it's a really big deal. And I wanted to talk through it with you. The short version of it is over the last couple of days, the Taiwanese dollar has surged about 10 to 11%. On the US dollar. It's not the only one. There have been some other currencies. So the South Korean won is up about 6.4%. This is now over the last month. The Thai baht up about 5.2%. Malaysian ringgit also up about 5.2%. The Singapore dollar in there at 4.6%. So all of these different Asian currencies creeping upwards. The Hong Kong dollar has been trying to do this. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority has been intervening to keep it. It's at the upper edge of its band, and so far they've been able to keep it there. You might have also seen China is intervening too to keep the yuan where it is. That was a really interesting headline to me because it's the U.S. that is the chaos agent and China that is coming in stabilizing markets by keeping the yuan where it is and not devaluing. Anyway, but the big story is the Taiwanese dollar. And I was listening to a Louis Gov podcast that we'll put a link to in the show notes. And he was comparing it, Rob, as sort of the inverse of the Asian currency crisis of 1997. And I'm sure you have background here, but for the layman out there, in 1997, 1998, what was happening was that a lot of Asian currencies were pegged to the dollar, and there was a carry trade. So you would borrow dollars to purchase local currency, and then you'd get higher yields in that local market. The idea being the currency is going to stay pegged to the dollar, so that's great. Like the currency will stay the same, and you get some extra yield in these emerging markets, which is yielding a couple hundred basis points or whatever it was above what you would get in the United States. That was all fine and good, except that there was a bubble in Southeast Asia. It started in Thailand, and it eventually turned out that Thailand didn't have the reserves to defend the peg. And eventually speculators went at it. Their currency collapsed. It set off this whole thing. And it was really Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia is my understanding of the countries that were most affected. The way that Louis was talking about it was that this is sort of an inverse here of what's happening. So what's been happening in Taiwan and in some of these other Asian countries over the last 10 to 15 years is that you had weak Asian currencies relative to the dollar and currencies that were declining in value against the dollar by 2 to 3% sort of annually, almost sort of like clockwork. And that you had Asian funds, Taiwanese insurance companies, all these other things. They were buying U.S. treasuries. So they were getting the yield off U.S. treasuries. Their assets were increasing relative to their local currencies because their currencies were declining on the dollar. And the idea is that this is a huge transfer of purchasing power from west to east. So as these currencies appreciate quickly against the dollar, suddenly some of these Taiwanese insurance companies, which were not hedging as well as they used to because interest rates were rising in the United States over the last couple of years, they've basically lost like 2 to 3 years of profits just over the last couple of days. And could some of these insurance companies, should they be hedging their positions? Are they going to have to sell more dollars? Like, what is this, a reverse currency crisis? Like, that is the sort of setup that's being talked about out there. So that's the background. On our knowledge platform, I saw that you thought that it really wasn't that big of a deal. So I was seeing all of this chaos on Twitter and social media and all these people freaking out. And of course, you, the sober one over here, talking, thinking about Oliver Cromwell and other things that are more important. So break down for me what's signal, what's noise. Like, how are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I think it's not a big deal in the sense that it doesn't signal anything particularly bad, and certainly not for these Asian currencies that are the focus, which we'll get to in a second. But I'm glad that Louis Gave brought up the Asian financial crisis because I think it's really important history and context for this. In large part because, like, it's funny, markets are these reflexive things where something happens and then people respond to what's happened, and that creates some new set of conditions that makes a response to the response, right? And in the case of the Asian financial crisis, really what we've observed is we've seen the after effects of the Asian financial crisis for the last 25 years. And what I mean by that is the Asian financial crisis came about because at that time, capital markets were working kind of the way that they're supposed to, which was capital from the rich world goes into the emerging markets. And those emerging markets, like Thailand was the poster child of this at the time. They were running big current account deficits because they were absorbing investment capital and they were investing domestically and building hotels and factories and all the sorts of things, that you do with FDI. And when you had a sudden stop during the Asian financial crisis, you had a risk off move, and risk off meant fleeing back into the dollar. And because they didn't have the reserves built up, because they were running these current account deficits, they were vulnerable. So their currencies, it was an outsized response, and the Asian currencies collapsed. And we all kind of know that story. What you've seen since then has been a really deliberate move by Southeast Asian nations in particular. China is a unique example, but they're also, the embodiment of this, which is to run by default current account surpluses to accumulate US dollar reserves because they were fighting the last war, essentially. You got to build up those reserves so that if you have another sudden stop outflow, then you can protect your currency. And protecting the currency, especially in these nations, is so important because you don't want inflation. You don't want a currency crisis and all of a sudden, rice prices are up 40% because, the baht has collapsed, that sort of thing. So that's sort of the background to this. And what you had was, because of this accumulation of currency, that because of the running of current account deficits or current account surpluses, in order to do that, and we've talked about this many times, they were directing accumulated capital like a fire hose into the United States and accumulating that position. And it's really important to remember, and this is why I say partly this is why it's not a big deal, is these are not necessarily net assets. These are not unencumbered. It's not wealth. This is like a basis trade. So set against those US dollar assets are local currency liabilities. So some people call it carry trades, but carry trade to me implies like something that a speculator is doing, deliberately borrowing in one currency and buying in another currency. That's not what's going on here. These are institutions, mostly boring institutions, like Taiwanese life insurers, Japanese life insurers, Korean life insurers, basically companies that manage big pools of assets. But they have no choice because that's how the math works out. If you're running a big current account surplus, someone has to be taking that currency side of the trade. And what you've seen in the last few days, and this is getting to why like the move is not a huge deal from a financial plumbing standpoint, is because of the sudden move in the dollar, that's kind of thrown a big ripple in those offsetting assets and liabilities. Because if the dollar starts to drop, then the value of your assets against those liabilities, all of a sudden you get turned upside down because your assets are going down in value, your liabilities are going up, and then you have a problem and you need to unwind that trade. So what you've seen is all of these, highly levered players who are running these massive balance sheets with assets on one side and liabilities on the other, and not necessarily equity, but running these massive balance sheets, having to unwind that. And that's why you're seeing sort of a panic buy of Asian currencies, and it's exacerbating the sale of the US dollar assets because you're selling your assets to buy back your liabilities. That's hard to explain verbally without having like a diagram, but hopefully that clarifies a little bit sort of some of the movements you're seeing here.
No, it does to me. But so the question then to me is, so what happens next? So is this just like a brief moment of market turbulence and things will equalize? Are we now going to get a 23-year period where these countries are going to fight now this war where they're accumulating the local currencies? What does this mean? Like, I mean, you've been ahead of this on dollar weakness here for the course of the year. In our own strategies, we have heavy exposure in particular to the Singapore dollar. So this has been a nice pat on the back for us from that point of view. So, maybe take it from that practical point of view. Are you now looking at the Singapore dollar and saying, thumbs up, time to think about the next thing? Or are you more like, okay, like we are at the very early stages of a bigger move that might have more to unwind before we get to some kind of, stasis?
Yeah, it's a little of both. It's the end of the beginning, and I think what we've seen um, in the last week or so is a very strong signal that validates the thesis. Because, like, I just explained the mechanics of what happened and why. Like, it's not a crisis. It's not the next Asian, like, none of this. It's fine. Um, but at the same time, it signals something very, very important. And so I'm going to put the mechanics side over here and go to the analysis side. The analysis is the US dollar is no longer the risk off asset. You do not flee into the dollar when things are going bad. Now the US dollar, people are fleeing out of that and because things are going bad. And that's something that we've not experienced in the last 40 years. That is a big, big, big change. And what you're going to see in all likelihood over time, this is not an overnight process, is the post-Asian financial crisis kind of playbook that I just described is going to be unwound because these countries, first of all, can no longer rely on the United States to be the consumer, into which they export, by choice. But also they can't rely on the value of the dollar. Like that basis trade is no longer reliable. It's moving in the opposite direction, or at least much of the time it will be. So it's not so much that, oh, now they're going to pile into something else. I think it's an unwinding of this imbalance that had been growing over the last 25 years post-Asian financial crisis. And what that means overall is just, more variety in sort of the surplus or deficit position of these nations based on, other factors rather than just, we're going to accumulate reserves and plow them into treasuries. On the whole, most of these currencies will be stronger in part. And this is getting to the Singapore dollar thing, through the back door. We have to remember that most of these currencies are managed floats. Singapore dollar is a managed float, and it's not managed against the dollar. It's managed against a basket of currencies. So one of the things that we've seen in the last week, so in the case of Singapore, they had been really holding back the reins on that initial move in April when all of the currencies ran, in part because they're mindful of managing prices in the country. So they don't like really sharp moves in any one direction. But the other thing is all of these currencies that are sort of quasi pegged to the dollar, like Hong Kong, for instance, Taiwan, these are, sort of soft pegs. They're dirty floats, right? They're very managed by the central banks. one of the things that they will worry about is this notion of being tethered to a declining currency. So if you look, the value of the euro, for instance, against the Singapore dollar, against the Taiwanese dollar, has absolutely surged in the last 6 weeks. And that's a problem because that's importing inflation, not from the US, but no one imports from there anyway, but from all these other countries. So if you're anchoring yourself to this sinking ship, that causes problems from an inflation standpoint. So that's another factor that all of these nations have to take into account is like you can't have inflation rise because all of a sudden the thing you were going to import from, Japan or the EU is 20% more expensive in local currency terms.
Mm-hmm. Man, I have a few more questions there. So, I mean, I'll throw three questions at you and you take them in whatever order or whichever way you want. So the first is that, you just said that these are, what did you say? Soft peg, dirty floats. Maybe that's the title of the podcast. I don't know. Title of your memoir, Soft
That
Peg,
sounds like
Dirty Floats.
bathroom humor right there.
But it's not. It's actually extremely sophisticated analysis of financial markets. So, these banks don't like sudden moves. But what's happened in the Taiwanese dollar over the past week sure seems sudden to me. It would seem to be the thing that they don't want. So what's driving that? Is it literally like, were they okay with that? There has been speculation that that's a signal to the Trump administration for some kind of free trade deal or some kind of, special dispensation because it's Taiwan and blah, blah, blah. Chinese yuan has only gone up less than 1% since April 2nd. That seems to be the elephant in the room or the dragon in the room to me. Do you think that we're going to see a move in the Chinese yuan? And do you think that China is this part of the negotiations? Are they holding back? Like, how do we think about the yuan here? And then the other thing is the saving grace. And this gets to a topic we're going to back into later in the podcast is, yes, like I guess you're worried about some imports being more expensive, but oil's hanging out below 60, like OPEC plus is surging production. Like some things out there are looking pretty deflationary. So we'll get to oil in a little bit, but talk to me about the suddenness of the Taiwanese dollar move and the yuan and whether there's enough reprieve from deflationary forces for some of these commodities out there that will help I guess cushion the blow.
Yeah, so there's been some talk about, it's the new Plaza Accord, or the Taiwanese are trying to put a shot across the US's bows, or they're trying to signal, we're going to allow our currency to appreciate, so therefore give us better treatment from a tariff standpoint. I don't really think any of that is what's going on. I mean, this was way too sudden. If you look at the problem with Taiwan in particular is relative to the size of the economy, which is tiny, the amount of balance sheet is enormous. So, this is like Luxembourg, like they're a very small economy. That's why you saw this happen in Taiwan, this sort of sudden break, I think, relative to like a Korea or, a larger economy, because the sheer volume of assets and liabilities that are matched against each other is so huge relative to the actual economic activity going on. So what I'm getting at is like this was market forces moving as an unstoppable force in one direction, and they just had to let it go. Because even though in this case it's totally opposite if you're trying to defend your currency, like there you have to husband your reserves and make sure you're not like that was the Asian financial crisis scenario. This is the opposite. It's just, well, how quickly can we sell Taiwanese dollars to stop this appreciation from happening? But when you have sort of basically a short covering situation, which is what this is, it's at some point you just have to let it go and sort of let the market find its place and then work it back. So I think this is mostly kind of a boring mechanical explanation. I don't think that the politicians who would have the authority to send a shot across the Americans' bows or whatever you want to call that would even have had the wherewithal or the time to make that kind of decision. Like this happened very quick. So I wouldn't draw strong political conclusions from this. I think but it doesn't take away from the sort of underlying reality, which is this is representative of that major change in relationships. And that's a much longer term, much bigger, and honestly, much more important than any political signaling. Like it's truly the tectonic plates of the global economy lurching in a different direction. And that's really big.
Hmm. What about the Japanese have since walked this threat back, but there was the hint of a threat last week to sell U.S. Treasuries. Like I said, they've walked it back in the last day or two. But how does that fit in here? Because the yen, obviously, not one of the currencies that I mentioned there.
It's a good question. I think you'd need a specialist Japanese analyst to understand all of the stuff at play there. I think they're scared. Um, I think I think they realize that they have limited cards that they can play. They're under a lot of pressure to show that they're not bending over for the U.S. Um, I don't really think that their treasury position is a weapon per se. As we talked about before, the U.S. is not dependent on foreigners to finance its current account or to finance its deficits. We had a big conversation about this like a month ago. So, and Japan knows this. They know if like maybe they'll have an impact in the short term, but it's not really a weapon. So I think it's more them searching for some source of leverage. Like what I just said, probably Trump doesn't know, or like he doesn't. The people around him aren't exactly, other than Besant. Um, they don't really. They probably might take that as a real threat, or it's perceived as a threat, but it's not. They don't really have any true leverage, and none of these countries do, beyond the very short term. So I wouldn't read too much into it, other than kind of verbalizing stuff for political reasons.
I appreciate your nod to Besant being the smarter one in the room, but I would say he's not covering himself in glory right now with how he's with some of the interviews that he's given in the last couple of days. Kind of seems like maybe he knows things academically, but like I don't know that he knows what's going on either. Last question on this. This is not investment advice, but we're sitting with big clients. We were talking about institutions and pension funds and insurance funds and things like that. But a lot of the listeners here are not in that rarefied air. If you're just a normal human being who's thinking about like your account or something like that, is this just something, is it just a passing thing? Like you're not going to go out there and accumulate Singapore dollars, I assume. Is it really like no impact on the smaller investor? Or if you're a smaller investor, like what are some things to think about in this context?
Well, I think the playbook for the smaller investor is a version of what we're doing for much, much larger investors, which is diversification away from the US. Because much like, we talk about financial markets fighting the last war, the investment industry is always fighting the last war because they will sell you what has worked in the past. So if you look at the average allocation from any US based advisor, it's overwhelmingly US. And that has worked for a very long time because the rubber band stretching between the US and the rest of the world in terms of valuation and sentiment and all this stuff that we've talked about, everyone kind of knows this now. That is stretched to the limit. But sort of the next step is to really look and think about, okay, well, what is my portfolio? What is my exposure right now? If you have 80% of your portfolio in the US, that's too much. That's not representative of the world in any way, shape, or form. And it's going to put you on the wrong side of things as that rubber band stretches back in the other direction and you get that reversion to the mean. And ultimately, what that probably looks like is overvalued US assets kind of just chop that off over the course of years. And it's not going to be some collapse. It's not going to be some dramatic event. It's just going to be sort of the boiling frog syndrome where they just don't do very well and the rest of the world catches up, and continues to grow. So if you don't have that exposure, if you don't have that diversification to the rest of the world, which makes up 75% of the GDP and 96% of the population, then what are you doing? You have the ability to do that. Just that's not the default setting for most institutions. And, many people are out there saying, oh, well, China's not investable. Someone was telling me about this GaveCal interview and that he was talking about international, and some said, well, you can't put money into Europe because they're dying, like that's nonsense. And that is the consensus view, and it's nonsense, like in plain terms. So international diversification, thinking globally, and this is just like, if you believe we're entering a multipolar world, which is one of the main themes of what you've been talking about for years, if you if you're drinking Jacob's Kool-Aid, then you have to do that from an investment standpoint to benefit from it, because now events are proving that we're right, basically. I mean,
Yeah, don't drink any kids. Don't do drugs and don't drink Kool-Aid. I have to confess to you, I am so uncomfortable with the move towards a multipolar world because I am a contrarian at heart. And when things are happening that confirm what I thought, like I want to zag the other direction. So I like literally am sitting here torturing myself about all the ways I'm wrong and not being able to find them. Anyway, we don't need to do I don't need to get on the psychoanalyst couch here. Okay, that was great. Let's move on to our next topic. This is going to start a little bit silly, but I think it's actually serious. I'm curious how you'll react to this because we haven't talked about this yet, Rob. So President Trump, this is 2 days ago now, on May the 4th, may the force be with you, had a Truth Social post in which he talked about the movie industry capitalized. I don't know why he capitalized those letters. In America dying a very fast death. And he said that he wanted the Department of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative to immediately begin the process of instituting a 100% tariff on any and all movies coming into the United States that are produced in foreign lands. We want movies made in America again. Howard Lutnick responded, "We're on it." I don't need to say anything else about Howard Lutnick. It seems silly. And by the way, when I was looking at sort of the background of this, I missed this. Did you know that in January he appointed some special envoys to Hollywood? John Voight, Sylvester Stallone, and Mel Gibson were tasked with bringing Hollywood back bigger, better, stronger than ever before. I'm not kidding. This is an actual thing that happened. I just totally missed it. So like there's sort of that thing in the background. There's also the larger like entertainment piece where I know for a fact that, you know, lots of movies either get made or don't get made based on whether they can be sold in China in the future. Like China in particular has become a very big player in this. Like there's a reason in Top Gun Maverick, China is not the bad guy. It's like some unnamed country somewhere far away. Like if you start putting China as the bad guy, like you're not going to sell in China. And then like all this math doesn't work. So there are things like that. I also confess to you, I've been reading On Protracted War by Mao at night because the Chinese the People's Daily said you should be reading that more. So I'm listening to them. Actually, my 2-year-old picked up the package from Amazon and was reading On Protracted War on our living room floor. Budding communist that she is, I guess, or whatever Mao was. Anyway, but it's funny because in the very introduction, Mao uses propaganda not as a dirty word. He talks about propaganda being a force for good, a force for uniting the country together, and that the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda was not good enough. And that was an interesting flip in my mind. But I'm bringing it up because Hollywood and the US music industry, they are extremely powerful. Back when I was at GPF, one of my favorite pieces that I wrote, I was talking about propaganda around the Russian interference claims. And I compared sort of the Russia Today's YouTube channel, which had 800 million views over 10 years. That was back in 2015 when I wrote this. And I compared that to Justin Bieber having 2.5 billion views on just one of his songs. So it's like, okay, like, yes, there is propaganda, but like really, if you just like listen to American music or watch American movies, like that's always been much stronger than authoritarian propaganda. I will remember vividly, I was in Bucharest in Romania at an event years ago now. And I was seated next to this guy, and he had heard on a podcast or something that I liked, Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd. And he told me the story about how he used to pay smugglers at the port to lift Alice Cooper and Led Zeppelin like records off the ship so that he could listen to it in his house. And he was worried that his parents would get taken to the gulag if they knew that he was listening to this forbidden music. And it's because like this like America centric, but also Western music and all these ideas were really, really attractive to most of the world. All of which is so there is like something in there. But the problem with that is like Hollywood and music and all those other things, it's effective propaganda because it's not propaganda. It's not the president telling you make a song that makes people feel things about the United States. It's literally just musicians like making things that they feel and people wanting to associate with those feelings and then wanting to be in a society where they can have those feelings freely. So if like you're really like there's that sort of rabbit hole that I wanted to go down here. But then the second thing I wanted to ask you about, and this I took from Justin Wolfers, who I've only recently discovered. He's a economist, I think at U Michigan. He's been doing some great interviews lately. I've found them really entertaining. And I invited him on the podcast. Hopefully he will come on. But he raised the idea that this might actually be a backdoor into tariffs on services because it doesn't really, like, what does a tariff on movies actually mean? It's not clear that it's legal. Is that a good? Is that a commodity? Is it a service? Like, are we talking about the actual like camera work and things like that go into it? And here is sort of something I think that we haven't talked about very much. We've talked about it a little bit, but services account for more than 70% of US economic activity. And last year, the United States exported over $1 trillion worth of services to the rest of the world. And it might be more than that. The US Bureau of Economic Analysis had a whole report about how it's kind of hard to track services, and their estimate might be that it was over $2 trillion for services that the United States exported. We import roughly a little less than $1 trillion, so around 800 billion. So in the same way that there's this leverage, the United States maybe has leverage or not. If you're thinking about goods, tariffs on goods, the opposite is the case when you're thinking about services. So what is to stop, for example, countries from coming out and saying, okay, in response to Liberation Day, we will now have Retaliation Day, and we will impose tariffs on all of these U.S. services, and we will support European and Chinese and Singapore investment professionals and insurance professionals and accountants and everything sort of else. So it just seems like Trump is opening a Pandora's box here with the service. Like, I don't even know if he realized it. Maybe just, Sylvester called him one night and said, yo, man, I really need a Truth Social post about how we need to make movies in America again. So anyway, riff any way you want on that. Maybe take the services thing, whether that's something to be scared of. And if you want to riff on Hollywood and things like that, feel free to.
Well, what you're describing is really, in some ways, this notion of soft power that everyone talks about. As an American who does not live in America, I can tell you it's hard to find really good examples of soft power, at least here in France, which is an outlier in terms of its own cultural production and its view of America for sure. But when you think, like, just to give you an example, like, people in our generation, most of them know lots and lots of American music, and they don't even know what the words mean, but they know the music by heart, right? That's not really the case for the younger generation, is my impression. Like, for reasons that are specific to music, that are specific to movies, just from a bottom-up standpoint, I think there's been just less clout anyway. So that's kind of a factor that's been going on in the background anyhow, sort of irrespective of all the sort of tariff stuff. The other thing to keep in mind with services is, not only is the US more exposed in terms of its actual balance, like, yes, part of the reason why the US has 4% unemployment and, our manufacturing sector has shrunk dramatically in terms of how many people work there, as you talked about, is because everyone works in services. So by definition, that's where your exposure is. And a lot of those services are directed abroad. And it's easy to forget how that's a form of soft power too. It's not just movies, it's not just cultural productions and things that we think of. It's also, consulting firms and, technology firms and everything, professional that is exporting their work abroad. It's not like something you put on a pallet and put in a container and ship it across the sea and no one ever sees you or interacts with you. Services are, by definition, in many ways much more personal. They are a form of soft power. They're a form of engaging with the world. So, yeah, I mean, from an economic standpoint, it's really stupid because we are exposed. We're vulnerable. It's like, throwing a rock and you live in this glass house. I mean, that's essentially what we're doing. But it also just kind of accelerates the withdrawal. And I know some people have this view that American soft power has never been greater. Like, I don't really know that I buy that. Tyler Cowen has said that many times in the last 3 or 4 years. For example, he's a very highly followed, commentator on these things. So there's definitely a counter thesis out there, but I don't really see it. And this is not going to be good for it, no matter what happens. So yeah, it's definitely an own goal, and it's also kind of another confirmation, not only from an economic standpoint, but just in terms of cultural integration, people interacting with each other, that tide is receding, and you know, local services emerging to take its place.
Yeah.
That's multipolarity. There's your
Uh,
catchphrase.
yeah, I guess so. I wish I had a different catchphrase. I really don't like that word, and I still can't find a word to replace it. One thing that was interesting, if you look at China's services PMI, it fell to its lowest in September 2024, um, and it's at the weakest level in the last 7 months. Even while in the United States, the services sector has actually picked up. Despite the threat of tariffs, despite all the policy volatility coming out of the White House, so there is an underlying strength here for the United States, and I do get the sense that maybe a lot of these countries aren't talking about services in part because they want deals with the United States and they know that if they threaten services, like things might actually get real, or I don't know, maybe they don't have the ecosystems yet ready to replace them. But
Well, just
yeah,
to jump in on that, because like we have to remember, for most countries, services are not an export. Like services in China are like, picture the guy with the little crappy shop on the corner. Like, he's not exporting to the United States. And that's the case in most countries in the world. Like here in France, most services are small business serving domestic, in many cases, just local markets. That is the norm. So those two things are not, those are two very different things, in terms of the tradable services sector, which is very specific and very small, and where countries like the US really dominate because they have these huge organizations, big businesses that are performing work abroad. You know, KPMG is doing, you know, accounting and audit work in 200 countries or whatever, you know, they can boast about. Like, that is what we're talking about, versus most other countries, they just don't have that developed yet. And maybe they will over time. Like, that's kind of what we're talking about.
yeah, and this notion of U.S. soft power never being stronger. I don't know. I would push back against that. I mean, some of this, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So, like, I'm obviously going to think that U.S. soft power is not good if you're appointing people like Mel Gibson and Sylvester Stallone to represent what is supposed to be best about the United States. Like, Mel Gibson's just an easy one. Like, I hope I don't need to tell you all the reasons that Jacob Shapiro would be uncomfortable with Mel Gibson being a representative here of United States soft power. But all that said, I think I would also try and be serious for a second and say that my impression from being around the world and talking to people around the world is not that U.S. soft power is at any kind of zenith. I'm not saying it's gone, and I'm sure there were naders before. I'm sure if you were talking to people in the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War or even the later stages of the Vietnam War, that opinions about the United States would have been extremely negative. But it seems to me that the companies or the things that have their finger on the pulse this way are these large tech companies that are associated with things like AI and social media and all these other things. Like, it seems to me that that's where the real soft power is, not in the form of the U.S. government and the U.S. representing a better way of life, because demonstrably, like whether it's in education outcomes or health outcomes or all these different things, the United States can't make that argument anymore. And even in terms of freedom, like, okay, like the United States invaded Iraq and it deposed a dictator on false terms. It's now picking a trade war after it profited from globalization for however many. Like, all these different things, like these things add up over time. Now, most of those tech companies are U.S. companies and are the benefactors of U.S. innovation and research and things like that. But the United States is cutting that out from underneath itself too. So I have a hard time wrapping my mind around the idea that U.S. soft power is ascending. It seems to me that soft power has actually sort of transferred to these larger companies. And this is something you and I talked about years ago, like when the first Trump administration was going after Huawei. I sort of made the argument at the time, Huawei has more in common with Microsoft than it does with any other Chinese company. Like, those are the peers, and in fighting Huawei to like improve the situation of US companies, you actually kind of delinked like an interesting sort of network. Anyway, I'm rambling a little bit there, but I would push back against the notion that U.S. soft power um, is at a zenith right now.
Yeah, and just a final thought on soft power. I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to measure, and people can argue both ways. Like, there's no way to judge. But one thing that you said earlier was soft power is not forced. Like, and I think that's a really important thing. Like, America is squandering so much of its soft power here by just disengaging with the world. Like soft power is being the beacon on the hill. That was what the Soviets could never match. Was, as all the former, Soviet people will say when interviewed, like the blue jeans, the fucking blue jeans killed us. Like, but that wasn't like a CIA op. It was just, it just was what it was, and it was open, and it was there for everyone. And this notion that, we're going to somehow increase America's soft power by doing what we're doing from a policy standpoint, it's clearly going to have the opposite effect. And I think you're seeing that in a major way. Like, let me tell you what soft power is to me. Soft power is, I live in Paris. I see tourists come here from all over the world, and they have like their, what I call their Paris experience. Like, you could just see them, like women, they dress in, I don't know, they don't dress like this at home, that's sure, but they put on like what they think is like the Paris thing to wear, and they're walking around, and their like eyes are big, and they're taking selfies, and oh my god, for some of them it's like the experience of a lifetime. It's like, that's soft power, is like to have the allure, that's kind of a silly example, but that's not something that you can dictate. Um, Even though Macron, I'm sure, has a 40-point PowerPoint plan to increase it, but
I'm sure he did. There was an article in the New York Times over the weekend about how Macron is trying to be more personable, talking to local shopkeepers and things like that. Probably sharing his 40-point deck. And and it's been a few episodes since we referenced Blade Runner, but I will say, like, I'm going to be really curious to see if Asian soft power rises here in the next couple of decades. Like, if you think back to the original Blade Runner and the intermix of specifically Japanese, a little bit Chinese of like futuristic dystopian LA. Like, I wonder if China will have soft power. I've turned on Chinese movies before because I think they're kind of fun, especially like the shitty action ones. But some of the others, like, there's a lot of good stuff coming out of China. I don't think that's a mainstream thing, but it'll be interesting to see if China can grow any soft power right now, because really China doesn't have much, or at least it doesn't have much in most areas of the world. It might in places like Singapore or like some of these other places, but it's pretty restricted. Okay, last big topic we should talk about. And this is something I'm a little confused about. So I'm going to give you some scenarios and then ask you to think about, or at least tell me what you're thinking about this right now, Rob. Oil prices continue to flounder. I think we're below 60 a barrel Brent crude here on Tuesday, May 6th. I don't know where it's jumped, and maybe it'll be different on Friday. But over the weekend, OPEC Plus said they were going to add almost 500,000 barrels of oil a day in June. So you've basically got OPEC Plus saying we're going to pump more. And it's a little bit confusing why they would want to do that, because if you're putting more supply on the market, that means you're going to drive the price of oil down more. And that's going to be really bad, in particular for Saudi Arabia. I was trying to find the break-even price for Saudi Arabia's budget, what they need oil to be at in order to balance their budget. And the numbers are all over the place, but I found a range from about $80 to $96 a barrel. As I said, we're sub 60 right now. So Saudi Arabia is nowhere near balancing their budget. They actually just posted their biggest fiscal deficit since 2021 on a quarterly basis. That's roughly, I mean, they've had consecutive deficits now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 quarters in a row. I mean, it's not looking particularly good. Their deficit for just Q1 was almost $16 billion. That's half the government's expected gap for 2025. And you've got Goldman Sachs saying their deficit could soar to $67 billion this year because of oil prices. So it's a little bit strange that Saudi Arabia is the one pushing this. There are a couple different theories out there about what Saudi Arabia is doing. The first idea is that the rest of OPEC, and OPEC is always a prisoner's dilemma, has not been following through with production cuts, specifically Kazakhstan and Iraq. So Saudi Arabia is saying, okay, enough of this. Like, if you're going to continue to not abide by what we all agreed on to cut to keep prices up, so you're selling oil when you shouldn't be, and we're the ones taking it on the chin, fine. You want to get into an oil price war with Saudi Arabia? We can do this for a couple of quarters. You can't. By the way, I should have said their most recent deficit seems like was funded by borrowing, which is an interesting sort of wrinkle to throw in there, not going back to reserves. So maybe they can borrow more than they used to be able to. Maybe that's a really negative sign. Just put that in the back of your mind too. So option one is punishing Kazakhstan and Iraq. Option two is they just decided that they wanted more market share. And this is actually what was happening in global markets right before COVID lockdowns. it was really big. You had Saudi Arabia and Russia engaging in an oil price war because Saudi Arabia was like, fine, let's cut it to 20 a barrel. Like, how low do you want to go, Russia? We want to squeeze you out. We want to seize market share. The idea being Saudi Arabia can last longer than some of these other competitors. So that argument is it's about much more than Kazakhstan and Iraq. It could be about Russia. It could be about the US shale producer. It's about saying, no, let's drive oil really, really low, see who's left standing after, I don't know, $40 barrel oil a couple months later. And let's see, Aramco will be up to the task. We'll figure it out. And then the last theory out there is this is really about aligning with the United States, that President Trump wants lower oil prices, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular are in a position to deliver that. And in return, they will get all sorts of defense goodies and maybe other things. And maybe they won't have to be so hard on the Palestinians too in order to get their defense deals and security contracts and shiny weapons from the United States as well. And maybe even other considerations that we're really not thinking of. I don't know why this flashed into my mind too. The rejoinder to the American soft power thing, Rob, you probably remember in the first Trump administration when, President Trump was in Saudi Arabia and Toby Keith, may he rest in peace, playing a concert in Saudi Arabia and dancing with the swords. There's soft power, Jacob. Stick that where Toby Keith told the terrorists to put it. Anyway, so I'm you can tell that I've had a lot of coffee today. I'm feeling great. So talk to me about oil, Rob. Are you like, because I'm a little befuddled here. Like, it makes sense that oil prices would be low if we're headed towards recession and everybody's worried about the global trade war and things like that. But Saudi Arabia cutting like this and like really, I mean, their balance sheet looks really ugly here in this month ahead. Maybe an Iran deal lurking behind the corner too. What if Iranian barrels are back on the market in any kind of meaningful way? Like, a lot of these things are not quite lining up to me. Are any of those explanations convincing, or do you have others?
I don't find the last explanation convincing, that they're doing this to please the US. I think that's implausible. The way I would think about this is sort of taking a company bottom-up analogy. Like, we've been talking about this recently with, last time we talked about US profit margins and how a lot of these companies have been riding on very high margins and yet have signaled that they're willing to eat the tariffs, to give up margin in order to protect and gain market share. And this is what happens with cartels. What I just described is sort of a very soft cartel. Price competition, how intense is it, or not? And cartels are always easier to do when fundamentals are moving in your favor. Like, look at when OPEC first emerged. Like, global oil demand was just secularly increasing. Like, that was a great backdrop. The problem right now is really twofold. The first is you have the secular issue, which is that the largest country in the world in terms of, population and number of cars on the road, 8 out of 10 new cars is now a battery electric car. And like, oil consumption in China has already peaked. So anyone who's paying any attention is looking at what BYD is doing, is looking at the fact that Toyota just released a $15,000 EV vehicle that it will not be selling in the US, but it's selling, everywhere else in the world, and looking at the amount of capacity that's getting built in the battery supply chain. And you're not feeling super enthusiastic about the long-term outlook for crude oil demand. So that's sort of in the back of everyone's mind. In the short term, you have a major cyclical problem, which we didn't talk about this, but this inventory cycle, all the cyclical indicators are not good, for reasons that are obvious. And compiling those two things, or compounding them, I should say, is that you have this cartel dynamic. And the cartel dynamic is, when things are bad, cartels break. And things are bad in most parts of the world right now. Russia, they don't give a shit about maintaining the cartel. They need revenues. And this is the same thing with companies. Like, if you do any analysis of, like, especially cyclical companies that have high fixed costs and relatively low operating expenses, they will produce the shit out of whatever they're making when they need to protect their market share. And if they have financial distress, especially, like, this is just textbook finance. If a company is levered, they will cut price to keep the revenues flowing and keep the volumes flowing, because absorbing that fixed capital, that fixed cost base, overwhelms all other considerations. And I think that's what what you're seeing here is things are not good for many of these countries. A country like Nigeria is hanging on by a thread. They have major, major issues. Do you think that they're thinking long term? It's just like, it's just human behavior. When things are bad in the short term, you think about the short term and you prioritize, hey, you need $1 in your pocket today and forget about costs. We'll figure it out later. Oh, it's just depreciation. What does that matter? That's not a cash cost. Oh, whatever. We can scrap those assets and sell it. We need to produce volumes. We need to have money flowing in. And in many cases, this is how a lot of these more shitty regimes finance themselves, is like you need to have cash flow, because the cash flow then needs to be sent out to all of your cronies and all of the people who are supporting your regime come hell or high water. Because if that cash flow dries up, then you have coups and political upheaval and all the stuff that that a lot of these, I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia, but lower quality regimes, that's a major consideration. So, all of this applies, and it's just going to probably get worse. I mean, cyclical deviations notwithstanding, like if we have a rebound, it'll get better for a while. But this is, I think, kind of the long-term trajectory of what we're seeing. And Saudi, I think they're in a very tough spot. They talk about Dutch disease. We talked about that a while ago. Like they've been living with Dutch disease for 70 years, which is, they made all this easy money on oil, and it's very difficult to diversify your economy away when it's so small. Neom or whatever, it ain't going to do it. I wouldn't be holding my breath for the line. Let's just say that much.
No, although I'll take the opposite side for devil's advocate. I mean, at least they're trying. They are meaningfully trying to diversify and to get away from this. And there have been some big cultural changes in Saudi Arabia over the last couple of years. I mean, you said the thing about high quality regimes. I mean, there basically was a coup in Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago. Just because you put the targets of your coup in the Ritz-Carlton doesn't make it not a coup. So
it was a very, very nice coup.
Lovely coup. Like, we should all be so lucky. But Saudi Arabia is also not the worst off here, because they are, their break even for oil is expensive, not because it's expensive for them to get oil out of the ground. It's because they have all of these grand commitments and things like that. But they're still one of, if not the cheapest country to get oil out of the ground. They've got a war chest of hundreds of billions they can rely on, good credit, like all these other different things. It's not like a Nigeria, as you referenced, or some of these others. So they at least have some, like they have enough, they have an ambition to get away from this and enough resources to where it's not completely unrealistic. I think you and I are both skeptics on it, but hey, like maybe there's a positive scenario.
Yeah.
But if you're a Kazakhstan though, or an Iraq, like, geez, this sucks, doesn't it? Sorry, go ahead.
It is worth, because it is a little unfair for me with regard to Saudi Arabia, because the other Gulf states have shown that it is possible to bridge that gap. Like, look at Dubai. Dubai, by any standards, or Abu Dhabi, have been success stories in terms of becoming these entrepot nations. And I think that's what Saudi Arabia is trying to recreate with a lot of these things. Like, and maybe that could work. And a lot of them, like if you look at a country like Dubai used to be based on pearls. Like the whole economy was just pearls, like literally getting pearls out of the ocean and selling them. And then you had artificial pearls, and they were fucked. And they found a way, and they pivoted to oil. Like, so these smaller nations, like, I talk about the Dutch disease and stuff, but one of the benefits of being small is that you can pivot like that. And sometimes, if you're lucky and you're thoughtful about it, it can be successful. So I don't want to be unfair to the Saudis, but they do have a difficult task. And part of the problem is they're competing now with the other Gulf states who have already sort of taken that playbook and established themselves. So it is a different situation. And yes, Kazakhstan, Iraq, Nigeria, just for everyone to know, in our internal notes, we have like notes on every individual company or country, and Jacob's notes for Nigeria are just dumpster fire, stay away.
Is that what they were? I maybe I don't remember because I thought I was a little kinder. I thought I put poor man's India, which is really saying something.
That is much kinder.
Yeah, I'm a diplomat. What can I say? Well, Rob, who do you think has the most to lose or is going to feel the pain the worst from low oil prices? Is this like the U.S. shale producers going to take it over the barrel, if you will? Is this, like we said, these Iraq, Angolas, Nigerias? Are these going to be the worst? I mean, there are also, there are Norwegian oil companies out there, Brazilian oil companies. Like, who do you think is? Because I don't think the Saudis are going to be hurt the worst. They're going to be hurt, but they're pushing this right now because they know that they have way more to fall back on than some of these other countries that they're going after. Maybe it's Russia too, with all the sanctions. Like, where would you be watching for negative impact of low oil prices if this continues on for months and quarters?
I mean, not to be too simplistic about it, but the higher cost producers, like Saudi, will be the last man standing because they are the lowest cost producer in the world. And U.S. shale, all else equal, is pretty low down the stack as well. So, really, I think you're looking at offshore areas in lower quality geologies, like anything that's going to be negatively impacted by inflation more than others. Like, it's easy to look at the price of West Texas crude, which is right now just below $60, which is where it was 5 years ago. On an inflation adjusted basis, that's like the lowest since 1999, I would reckon. Didn't do the calculation, but it's way lower in real terms than it's been for a generation. So there's going to be ramifications, and you're going to see marginal production drop in cases where it's not overwhelmingly a political decision to keep producing come hell or high water. So yeah, I mean, everyone kind of knows the countries that are oil dependent and lower quality and at the margin. Those will be the first ones to really have major problems. And that'll probably give a lease on life to a nation like Saudi, because that's going to be production that, over some time period is going to decline or go away, but it's going to be a rocky road between here and there.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget Guyana, ever my one of my emerging markets that if you could get access to would be fun. We should probably do a whole episode on artificial pearls and things like that. Like I went down this rabbit hole once upon a time because my wife's wedding ring is an artificial diamond, and I was convinced that the diamond industry would completely collapse once people realized that you can literally make a diamond in a lab and not worry about where it came from and who died to get it and which child slave labored it out of the ground. But yeah, maybe we should have a whole episode just on why, or I don't know, maybe you think diamonds are going to die a slow death, just like pearls. I don't know.
They are dying a slow death.
They are. So
diamond prices are down like 20% year over year because of emerging competition from lab grown. We were short Signet at off Wall Street at the end of last year, and they're in a tough spot with this artificial diamond business. That's for sure.
All right, well, there you go. Last thing, and we can do this really quick. This is on my, sort of radar in terms of we've had Liberation Day, tariffs have been in place for a while, but now we're starting to see the actual impact in terms of either ships not arriving or empty ships, things like that. Port of Los Angeles, if you're looking at the data, which I just had in front of me, but which just went away. Hold on, listeners. If you're looking at Port of Los Angeles data, change from previous year for May 4th to May 10th, down 35%. Change from previous week, 16, almost 17%. Next week, down 10%. This is in terms of vessels that are arriving. But then the week of May 18th, up 65% from the previous year. My mother-in-law was one of the many people who went to the car, the auto. Where do you buy cars? Not the car shop, the
auto
dealership.
Dealer.
Jesus Christ, I need more coffee. Like, went to the car dealership in order to get a car because she was worried. Oh my God, there's not going to be cars. And this seems to be a thing that's happening throughout the United States, where people are stocking up on furniture and umbrellas and shoes and all those things that are made in China that are not going to be made in the United States economically, guys. But you had, I think you were the one who brought up to me, Walmart and Home Depot and all those guys coming to the White House and conferring with Trump. And you've got some port data now saying, oh, 2 weeks from now, it looks like some shipments are up and the Chinese are backing off. And Besant is out there giving bumbling answers that, oh, well, we're not talking, but this is unsustainable in the long run. So, do you think this is going to be a quick reprieve, that it's just going to be like a 2 week crazy period? Or do you think that it's going to last longer than that? Because I was thinking it would be a longer gap than that, but that LA port data sort of made me sit up in my chair a little bit to think, well, maybe there was just a 2 week blockage, and maybe like, yes, for 2 weeks, like there'll be no toilet paper on the shelves and you won't be able to order things on Amazon, but maybe things go back to normal after that. I don't know. Like, what do you think?
I think people are really underestimating the actual scale of the damage that's happened here already. And I don't think markets are really pricing this in. So there's a few misconceptions out there. The first is people are thinking that there's been a lot of pull forward demand ahead of these tariffs that were just announced by like inventory build. I mean, so the tariffs were announced and everyone's rushing, all these businesses are rushing to buy stuff now. There's no evidence of that. And that's really concerning because you saw in January through the back half of last year, as we were heading into the election, and we talked about this at the time, you started to see businesses were accumulating inventory in advance of Trump's election, accumulating. This was growing throughout December and really peaked in January. Like January was a huge blow off top. And, we spoke with some members of the CI Club who work for industrial companies, and they were saying, yeah, we went out in January and we bought a lot of inventory because we're dependent on Canada, we're dependent on Mexico. These tariffs are coming through and we needed to really, ramp up our inventory levels. Like that was 4 months ago now. And since then, the indicators of inventory build have been really bad. And I think what people miss is that you're having the opposite effect, which is almost spooky, is businesses are not building their inventories ahead of this tariff increase. They're anticipating bad things and they're letting their inventories run out. So that's number one thing. Number two thing is everyone in markets are looking at these consumer companies and they're saying, okay, first half of the year is going to be tough, but they're all, for the most part, modeling improvement in the second half of the year. Well, the problem is a lot of these retailers aren't going to have anything to sell in the second half of the year. And like we always forget, like we model out these different parts of the economy and like we talk about freight a lot and shipping and inventories. Well, like that's important because managing a retail business is a tricky balance between having just enough inventory to drive sales, but not too much inventory that you have to discount. Mm-hmm. And now we're totally swinging to the level of you're going to see empty shelves in the next, coming weeks, depending on where you are. Like East Coast, this is probably going to happen soon because the numbers you just cited, like it takes time for these ships to get, like everyone focuses on the Long Beach and LA because those are the, the Western shipping hubs. But it takes time for this stuff to reach the East Coast, which is where most of the population is consuming stuff. And like all of these analysts in New York are in Manhattan and like, oh, well, Dwayne Reed has plenty of stuff, so no big deal. Like it's coming. Like it's very, we think people are so smart and observant. Oh, these finance guys, but like, I think we give them a little too much credit. So I think there's, yeah, well, I'm being diplomatic now. But there's complacency there. I think retail is really in a difficult spot. The damage has already been done, in other words. And really the thing to watch is to what extent do you have this ripple through into, okay, now you're starting to get job cuts. There's some early indications of like large scale layoffs. Not huge data points yet because it's early. That's always the last thing to happen. Like the employment cycle is always a lagging indicator. So I wouldn't be looking there yet, but the inventory cycle is looking very bad. And that consequentially is bad for consumer and retail, which is, as you pointed out, a huge part of the economy. The other shoe to drop or thing to watch is what happens with investment. fixed investment, CapEx. Meta came out and made a big thing. Oh, we're going to spend $80 billion on CapEx next year. We're not slowing down on AI. And God bless them, because if that represents what all businesses are doing and they're looking through it, then that will be definitely a mitigating factor. But if businesses are turning around and saying, whoa, there's way too much uncertainty here, we don't know what this guy is going to do from one day to the next, we have to rein in our CapEx budget, rein in our consulting budget, rein in our software budgets. That's a big sign. And one data point on that, in the last week, The Information, which is a really good thing to read, by the way, for people who are wondering, I love that. They ran a piece where they kind of got the scuttlebutt ahead of the annual. There's a period where all the advertisers get together, and the upfront, they call it, and they kind of hash out their ad budgets for the coming year, and everyone gets together. They have these, they present like, what are the big pieces of content in the coming year? It's a big hoo-ha. And the scuttlebutt ahead of this was that TV and streaming ad budgets were going to be down 10% year over year, which is that's a worrying, and that's a canary in the coal mine of business spending, confidence, all the stuff that we kind of know is getting hit. Like, now you're starting to see some of this actually show up in the investment data. That's very bad.
Well, on that rosy note, I mean, honestly, we've only touched what's going on in the world. Like, Israel's talking about seizing Gaza and firing back and forth with the Houthis. Friedrich Merz failed in his first vote to be chancellor. He got through in the second vote, but boy, was that a shot to our Germany thesis, at least on the front end. Australia elections, Canada elections, the UK and India just agreed to a free trade deal. So lots of stuff out there. But
what about Pakistan, India? Is that something we should be worried about?
We had an India analyst on last week. I'm talking to Kamran in 2 hours to tell him. So why don't I give you the answer next time we talk? I thought so, because they were saying, it's starting to feel like a hold me back fight rather than a real fight. It doesn't look like both sides are willing to go at it. But yes, anytime nuclear armed powers are threatening each other, we should probably also be at least a little bit worried. I would think so. It's not great. So lots of things to talk about going forward. All right, I got to run. Cheers, Rob. Thank you so much for listening to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. The show is produced and edited by Jacob Smulian, and it's in many ways the Jacob Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. It takes just a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us. Also share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about hiring me to speak at your event, or if you want to learn more about the wealth management services that I offer through Bespoke or at Cognitive Investments, you can find more information at jacobshapiro.com. You can also write to me directly at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I'm also on X for now with the handle Jacob Shap. That's Jacob, SHAP, no dats, dashes, or anything else, but I'm not hard to find. See you out there.